Hey, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is Liz joining you as usual from Central Virginia and the unceded lands of the Monacan Nation. And I am so glad that you are here with me today. And as always, if you want to know whose native lands you might be residing on, go check out the map at native-land.ca. Covers pretty much the entire world. And if you are interested in learning about the sacred feminine, first of all, you're in the right place. This is my 99th episode that I'm recording. So exciting. So there's a pretty extensive back catalog of podcast episodes if you're new here that you can move through and hear from some really amazing people. And if you want to learn from me, there's a few ways that you can do that. Go check out hometoher.com. There's a lot of older articles that are out there that I've written. There's information about my book, Home to Her, Walking the Transformative Path of the Sacred Feminine. That's available pretty much wherever you buy your books, and it's also available on Audible if you like to listen. If you like to listen to my voice, it's me reading. If you want to reach out to me and share your thoughts on this podcast, I would love that. I love hearing from you. Social media is a really good way to do that, but you can also send me an email through my website. All the social media handles are at Home to Her, but I'll put all of this in the show notes, so you don't have to remember it. But I love to get your feedback. I love to get your ideas on episodes, so please do reach out. So I've got a repeat guest here, and you guys know I've if you've listened to the podcast for a while, this happens a few times. Some of the conversations are just so wildly rich and exciting and wonderful that I just know it's got to keep going. And my first conversation with this guest was definitely like that. So let me go ahead and introduce her to you right now. Joy Ladin is a widely published essayist and poet, literary scholar, and nationally known speaker on transgender issues. From 2003 to 2021, she held the David and Ruth Gotsman Chair in English at Stern College for Women of Yeshiva University. Her gender transition and return to teaching in 2008 made her the first openly transgender employee of an Orthodox Jewish institution. Joy's experience of being poetically mentored by the Shekinah resulted in the completion of a book-length sequence, Shekinah Speaks, published by Selva Obscura in spring 2022, which she joined me to speak about on this podcast in 2023 is an amazing episode. So you should absolutely go back and listen to that if you haven't. She's also published several other books, including most recently a new book of poetry, Family, and Once Out of Nature, selected essays on the transformation of gender. She is the recipient of the National Jewish Book Award for the Book of Anna, and she has 2 Lambda Literary Award finalists, Impersonation and Transmigration, as well as 2 works of creative nonfiction. National Jewish Book Award finalist Through the Door of Life, A Jewish Journey Between Genders, and Lambda Literary and Triangle Award finalist The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective, the first book-length work of Jewish trans theology. And she is joining us today from her home in New York. Joy, I'm so glad you're back. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Liz. I'm delighted to be back.
Yeah, so our first conversation, I'm going to go back and look. I think it was the first episode of 2023, and I just remember feeling so incredibly fed and nourished by that conversation. And I think, usually if you all have been listening for a while, you know that I usually start with people's background and spiritual journey. And we had such a beautiful and rich conversation about that on the first episode. So I definitely encourage you to go back and check that one out. And I'll put it in the show notes. I think what might be a nice place to start, Joy, is if you want to tell us a little bit about your most recent works. First of all, I'm very impressed that you had 2 books come out at the exact same time. That's quite impressive.
I know it sounds really impressive. It makes me feel extremely productive and prolific, and we'll go with that. But anybody who's like you, who's put together a book, knows that there's a long, long lead time. Writing, editing, copying, editing, publishing, it takes a long time for a book to come together, and it really was a bit of a coincidence that these 2 books, both of which were accumulations, a collection of poetry and a collection of essays, so they're both accumulations of mostly earlier work, and they just happened to come together in a time where they could be published simultaneously by the same press, which is very cool, but it makes me seem like somebody who just writes books at the drop of the hat, and that's not that's not actually true.
I have heard that about poetry in particular, that sometimes you could have poems reflected for, in a particular book that have been written over a period of 10 years or something like that. Is that true?
Yeah, in family, there are some poems that are not quite 10 years old, but there are a couple that go back to the mid tens, and then there are books that were written very close to the time when the book was completed, because a lot of the book concerns and is informed by the my mother dying of dementia and other stuff. So it's a combination of an accumulation and also things that were close to contemporary in a way that was quite unusual for me. And it was personal in a way that was unusual because of growing up and spending so much of my life in the closet as a trans person. Writing autobiographically in poetry really has been difficult for me to learn. I've said I plenty of times, but it's usually distanced from the details of my life in a way that many of the poems in this book aren't. You know, they talk about things that actually happened in very specific ways, and I doesn't mean anybody other than myself. So it felt like a very risky book in that way. As my mother was dying, I was getting sicker, becoming housebound, and that's another strand that's in the book. And the landlord thought that would be a good time to sell the house that I'd been living in for 9 years. And so there were a lot of changes and things that were closing down, and that sense of things changing is part of the book. And then another part, the idea of family is presented as an expanding set of concentric circles. So it starts from very, very close in. And by the end of the book, there are poems about being, thinking of America during the first Trump era as as a family, and about what it means to be, part of the family of white Americans. So, so the book concludes with the autobiography of my whiteness, which is something that both separates me from some of the American family, but also because of the racial hierarchies that I and every other American is part of, also connects me. Like that's an unfortunate way, but it's a way that the American family is organized. And writing about that enabled me to, yeah, claim full membership, with all the ambivalences. I don't know about you and your family, but I had a lot of ambivalences about my connection with my family. And that comes out from the micro level of my relationship with my mother to the macro level of my sense of being part of this country.
Oh, I love that. Yes, I do. Well, ambivalence. I don't know. Yes, ambivalence about family, both at that national level and the individual level. And as you were saying that, I was thinking, I find that there's a tendency for me to, and I think I'm doing it intentionally, to create a story and a narrative that makes sense to me, that says, this is why I am in this particular family. This is why I have landed here at this particular
Mm.
time on Earth. And I'm kind of happy to say that it's a supportive story usually, but I'm also, it's a story that makes sense to me in a positive and affirming way. Like, I ended up here in this configuration to learn and to experience these challenges. And also, could I be wrong about that? Of course, I have no idea. But it helps me
Well,
make sense and move through my days.
yeah, it's not, narratives are, I mean, they're the facts that we put into narratives. Those can be accurate or inaccurate, but there's nothing narrative that's built into reality itself. Like life doesn't unfold narratively. So it's always an act of imagination, and it's one that human beings can't help but engage in, because a lot of our minds, a lot of our consciousness is structured narratively. There was a philosopher named Daniel Dennett who wrote, in fact, that our sense of a self, of an I, that there, that sense that you have that you're the star of your story. Like, now Liz is walking downstairs right? That sense, according to Daniel Dennett, that we organize our lives in terms of narrative, not in terms of stories, but just this sense of ongoing story, to produce the sense of I, to produce the sense that there actually is a coherent self that's living our lives, to create a center around which our brains can organize the myriad sensations and experiences that we have in relation to some kind of coherent standpoint. So he says, and I think this is borne out by my very amateur understanding of the structure of the brain and the way it works. Yeah, there's no I in the brain. There's a bunch of different parts of the brain that are constantly saying things, basically. And telling our lives as an unfolding story enables us to take these multiple voices with the different perspectives that they're in charge of and organize them in ways that make sense to us.
Mm.
So I would say you taking that and saying, well, you know what? I'm going to give myself a sense of meaning and place in the world and purpose by thinking of my life as a story. I think that is a beautiful practice, one that
Mm.
comes naturally to us, and that you don't have to worry. I think functional and dysfunctional is maybe a more important scale than true and false for the stories we tell about our lives.
Oh, I love that. Functional, dysfunctional. Yes, because what is true and not. And of course, if it's all narrative, then what is truth, right? That gets very slippery. Okay, we're just riffing here now. So I'm like, okay, I didn't know we were going to go here, but okay, I have a question about that. Then where and how do the boundaries of the body function and fit in, do you think, to the sense of I? If there is no sense of I in the brain of like, this is me, but we still are in physical form that has limitations and boundaries, and it separates me from you and me from this microphone and all of the other things around me, right? I'm curious how that fits into it.
Well, our brains do that. But we've both had children, so we both know that infants don't have that. They
Mm.
don't actually know at first where they end and where someone else begins. That's something that has to develop as their brains develop. But I think one of the jobs of the brain is to map the body and tell us that each part of it is actually part of our bodies. So you have some people who experience a form of body dysmorphia. Well, there are many kinds of body dysmorphia where your brain is telling you that your body is something upsetting, including sometimes people feel their brains tell them that some part of them is actually not them. And people who suffer from this will sometimes go so far as to beg to have those parts of themselves removed because it's so upsetting to have what's not you made you know, part of you. So it's complicated. It is something that's not automatic. And I think we now know that bodies are not boundaries. They're ecologies. And they're ecologies that are contiguous with and interchanging with other
Mm.
ecological systems. So all of that's very reassuring to me because the dissociation that went along with gender dysphoria and feeling that my body was wrong, which I think is that body mapping going off the rails there, has made it hard for me to locate my sense of self in my body.
Mhm.
So for a long time, for me, my sense of self was strongest. Like I couldn't talk to anybody who I felt actually knew me. So I could talk to myself, but you know, I'm dissociated, I'm traumatized, I'm young, so I don't actually understand things, and I'm kind of bonkers because all of this is too much for a kid. So talking to myself wasn't really a great way to stabilize my sense of self when I was young. Talking to God was my way of doing it. And God, as you know, I experienced as not fitting gender the way I didn't fit gender, but only really when I was talking to God did I feel like, oh, somebody else knows what I mean by I. And again, I don't know how it is for people who haven't gone through a blend of disorienting relations to self, but I think that being seen as who we are and feeling that we're being seen as who we are really helps stabilize our sense of self. Not necessarily more than our bodies, but I don't know. Now that I'm sick, I can tell you my body is not a great way of defining who and what I am.
Yeah. 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 Oh, so many things coming up as I'm hearing you speak. And I want to go back to something that kind of popped up when you started this thread here. And it was thinking about our first conversation and your relationship with the Shekinah and your book, Shekinah Speaks, which you said, infants, they don't know their separation from anybody else, right? And what I thought of is like, oh, well, to me, in reading that particular book of poetry, there was so much of the Shekinah speaking to you, to me, to whoever is the reader, right? And almost in a way seeming like she's continuously reinforcing that idea of, you think you're separate from me, but you're not. You think you are out here, you are another thing. There is no there is no me without you, or you without me, or however we would say that, right? And so,
Exactly.
yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I'm like, where was I going with that? But that's sort of what sparked, was that thinking of like almost like a return of sorts of back to that, recognizing that the boundaries are false anyway. Like, and perhaps we're
Yeah.
longing for that in our spiritual seeking as we move into maturity and adults.
I mean, as you were just saying, Shekhinah, I had, I think, talked about her melting binaries, but subsequently, through a dialogue with a friend who's a marvelous theological thinker, I realized that it's more like she takes, she does to binaries what giving a half twist to a strip of paper does to a strip of paper. When you do that and close a loop, so if you take a strip of paper and you run your fingers along it, it has two sides, right? Those sides never meet. If you give that paper one half twist and close the loop, it only has one side. As you run your finger along one side, it leads to the other, which totally freaked me out when I was a kid. I kept trying to figure out what had happened. But the Shekhinah likes to do that with all kinds of binaries, and what she does with the I and you, so that she wants to talk to us about who we are in ways where if we follow that along, we find ourselves on her side of the binary. And she talks about herself in ways where if we follow that along, we find ourselves back at ourselves. And on in an infinite loop, because there are two sides, but they run into each other in ways that binary thinking says that they can't and shouldn't. The divine human binary, the I-you binary, the self-other binary, inside, outside. There are all of these ways that we simplify and organize our experience. And the Shekhinah is like, oh, I know something fun we can do with that. This will be really interesting. If you think about male-female binaries the way they're often deployed, and I'm just going to reference kind of old-fashioned, but a while ago, I was talking to a trans guy, right? So born female, transitioned to living as a male. And he said, I always know when I've forgotten to take my testosterone shot. It's a weekly injection. I was like, how could you forget to take your hormones? Your life depends on that. But anyway, I always know I've forgotten to do that because when I walk into a room, I start thinking about how everybody else is feeling. And when my testosterone level is up, I feel like I'm complete, I'm integral, I'm rooted in my sense of self rather than being a self dissolving into a series of relationships. And I was like, yeah, why do you want the integral self instead of the right? It was classic. Like we were really like we had this kind of old fashioned gender binary relation. But so the Shekhinah, I think maybe in the gendered tradition of divinity, when you have a divinity who's identified with maleness and transcendence and power and all of those things, you have to have a divinity who is integral and separate. You can't really be powerful if you're not separate enough to exercise power, right? You can't be transcendent if we can't tell what's you and what's not you. So I think I think it's built into the tradition of using gender binaries to understand divinity. That's the way I would say it. Again, it's an act of imagination, ways of trying to feel close to a divinity that it's incomprehensible to us. It's within us, it surrounds us, it's beyond us, it constitutes us, all of these things. It's too much. It fries my brain. Sometimes when I have experience of the Shekhinah, I'll have these moments and I'm looking at the leaves and suddenly I'm realizing that, okay, so the Shekhinah is in me and the Shekhinah is in the leaves and the Shekhinah is a light shining on the leaf. And I just do that a tiny bit. I'm stuck in a room. I'm looking out a single window and my mind is blown very quickly by this. Intellectually, I can say, oh, the Shekhinah is everything and there's a point of view and everything. And, it's like I can say that, but actually experiencing that, my mind is quite blown. And I think the Shekhinah delights in bringing us to that place. So what I would say is this female gendered concept, immanent concept of divinity, tries to bring us to the places where those clear senses of boundedness and binaries, where they do lead to one another as opposed to being separate, which is marvelous and scary in one kind of way, and that transcendent, frequently male identified sense of divinity is marvelous and scary in a different kind of way. And both of them are just like fingernail pairings from the actual nature of divinity.
Yes, I have so many thoughts about this. How delightful that you can look out the window and experience what I think a lot of people need psychedelics to feel into, or some sort of altered experience. I've got experience with both now, and so I can, I know exactly what you mean. You look out the window and it's going to melt your brain, and then also, the door opening of the psychedelic experience too, which is similar and just louder. I think that's been my personal experience, but it's kind of a mind fuck, isn't it? Because what I heard in that thread of conversation is, you starting with your friend who is describing what it sounds like a legitimate biological experience of that is created by hormones, like that's the real thing. Like, when you're not taking your testosterone, you're feeling more connected. And that's like a thing that's present in his body as a result. I assume tell me if I'm wrong, but the assumption is being born
Exactly.
as female, right? So there's that piece of it that is like, well, that may be there. It sounds like that's there perhaps for a lot of people. Like that's a real thing. And there's the complete like just melting of binaries on the other side, which is like and it's just an it's all just wrapping around and bringing itself closer and closer. And I'm trying to formulate a question here, but I think that I'm curious for you, thinking about the Shekinah as like the guide, or is that how you see her? Is it even right to call her a her at this point? Like, but do you see her as sort of a guide to understanding and teasing apart some of this, or holding the complexity of all of this? Like, and has that changed for you in the last couple years since we've talked?
That is a really great question. I think that for me, there's something very anchoring about those female pronouns when thinking about the Shekhinah. She is not attached to them, right? She's not attached to any human terms.
Yeah.
But, if you have a child and you need to explain something to them, you need to explain it to them in terms they understand, right? There's nothing more important to your child than knowing that you exist in relation to them,
Yeah.
right? I would say who you are in yourself, in my experience, far less interesting to children than who you are in relation to them. And that's what our job as parents is, to be in relation to them. And that's why it's so darn hard, because we are ourselves also. And there's a distance there. So I think the Shekhinah uses human terms, and particularly gender terms, because gender terms are our fundamental terms for intimate relationship, right? So we have many other terms of relationship, like judge and that sort of thing. But it's gendered terms that tell us who we're like and who we're different than. It's gender terms that many of us use to figure out who our possible romantic and sexual partners are, right? It's gender terms that structure our intimate family relationships. It's all over because gender is where traditionally, and people like me, that's why people like me can be such a problem for people who live binary gender in traditional body-based ways. I'm not critiquing that, but somebody like me comes along and severs gender from the physical. One of the things that's so powerful about traditional binary gender is that it connects who you are with your body, with your physicality, with the needs that go along it, with this whole web of relationships, so that just by knowing your own body, you find yourself in a complicated web of relationships to theoretically every other human being. That's a web that, it becomes problematic to fit someone like me in that web. And if there's somebody who's non-binary, it becomes even more problematic. But every human way of understanding everything has limits and holes and problems in it. It's not to say that is not to say that there's something wrong with it. It's just to say that it's human. But, if I were a divine being trying to figure out how to relate to creatures who are so much in their bodies and who relate to one another so intensely in terms of gender, I would want to use those terms. I wouldn't want to try to invent a whole new system of relationships. Like there's no way in which the God who's called king in traditional liturgies is actually a king, right? But we can, on Yom Kippur, they switch the word in the liturgy, it switches the word God in a number of places, which, in other words, the word that points to this beyondness that's incomprehensible, and it switches to the word king because it saw that as a translation of divinity into more intimate human terms. For Americans, that's not really a source of intimacy, thinking of God as king. If you're a secular American, there's all kinds of problems with that. But compared to an incomprehensible being, you can understand a king, even if you're like nobody in relation to a king, like you don't have status, you're not a member of the court, you still have relation to the king because you're a citizen of the kingdom. The king has obligations to you, you have obligations to the king has a presence. There's all kinds of ways that this metaphor empowers human beings to have a relationship with what's beyond us. And that's the way the Shekhinah uses gendered and other terms. And it works that way for me. There is a way in which, probably because of my female gender identification, but there's a way in which I feel I can allow for a closeness or accept this sort of disquieting closeness. Like, wait, where are you? Are you in me? Are you around me? Are you, like this kind of, that it's easier for me in those gendered terms. And as I thought about this, as I like theologized it as opposed to working on the poems, I have found it, the abstraction of the gender, it makes it hard for the gender part to function in the same way. And when I went back, and I think I sent you the most recent writing that I've done on this trans Shekhinah.
Yes.
So I got a trans theology assignment, and I hadn't been thinking about trans theology. I was very into it in the soul of the stranger. And then I wasn't thinking about it because I was into the Shekhinah. But okay, I'll try to look at the Shekhinah from a trans theological perspective. And that led me to the origins of the Shekhinah. This comes up in the early rabbinic period, so the early centuries CE. I think actually is part of the same crisis and creative eruption in Judaism that led to Christianity. I think both the idea of Jesus an incarnated aspect of divinity, and the Shekhinah emerges to answer the question of, we're experiencing God as very far away, given the Roman domination of everything. And for me, this has a tremendous resonance with the way that I feel about the political situation in America. How can we feel close to God? Because when we look around the world, we don't see the power of God. We see the power of people who, to us, seem hard and cruel and amoral at best, and often quite a bit worse than that. How can we locate divinity? How can we feel close to divinity in this world? How can we feel that the divine understands our lives and what we're going through? Because in order to protect divinity from this world, so if you say, well, God's everything, God's the Romans who've just killed 1 million Jews and exiled 1 million more, that is problematic, right? And so now we're going to bless that God, right? So we want to, and if we say, well, in the ancient world, you would say you can tell how powerful a God is by their political fortunes of the nations they're associated with. Well, that's not a good way of locating God if the Romans have won everything. So I think the idea of God as transcendent and beyond becomes very important to secure the existence of a divinity. You want to have an outside to oppression. You want to say, well, okay, you may control my body, my soul, you may ravage my community, but there is that which is beyond you, to which you are, as Isaiah says, a drop in the bucket. When Isaiah says the nations are a drop in the bucket, that's the transcendent divinity. In Isaiah, in the biblical period, there isn't a distinction between transcendence and immanence. Isaiah describes God in terms that go all across that spectrum, and the Hebrew Bible does. But in this crisis, I think that there needed to be some kind of immanent sense of divinity to answer this question, because safeguarding God from history by imagining God as transcending history created this gulf, and people found hard to live with, particularly when they were suffering. And I think both Jesus and the Shekhinah were responses to that. So when the rabbis start to imagine the Shekhinah, the word is grammatically female. But to my great disappointment, because as I say, I was very invested in the pronouns here in terms of my own idea of the Shekhinah, the rabbis, who are as patriarchal as you can imagine, the rabbis of the Talmud, they are really not where you want to look for innovations in terms of gender thinking. They don't care about the Shekhinah's femaleness at all. They use the case endings and the verbs. What they're interested in is the Shekhinah is a way of understanding divine presence in the human realm. And the way that they imagine the Shekhinah, see, the first thing I would do if I was imagining the Shekhinah is I would say, well, where is the Shekhinah? And when is the Shekhinah? And how does one relate to the Shekhinah? What are the attributes of the Shekhinah? How does the Shekhinah relate to the other ways that we have of thinking about divinity, right? These are all, to me, logical questions. And later Jewish tradition uses binary gender to answer a lot of those questions, right? But the rabbis, for some reason, didn't care about this. So, one rabbi answers, says the Shekhinah mostly lives in the East. And then right after that, another rabbi says the Shekhinah mostly dwells in the West. And another rabbi says the Shekhinah is present whenever two people are talking about God. And another says the Shekhinah left the world when the temple was destroyed. And another rabbi says, even after the temple was destroyed, the Shekhinah's presence continued to dwell there. And nobody says, wait a minute, guys, all of these things can't be true. And there are many more. This is just a small selection. So that's what I ended up, the trans perspective ended up showing me, was that for them, it was more important that the Shekhinah be the aspect of divinity that can be in all kinds of relations to human realm and human experience simultaneously without any problem. Like the transcendence sets up this binary. You're either out there or you're in here. That was not what they were interested in. They needed an idea of immanence that was more like the scale on a trombone slide, all up and down. And so that's, I think, why they were not interested in gendering the Shekhinah, particularly because binary gender is about identifying everyone in relation to everyone else and fixing those ideas of presence. So later Jewish mystics who were interested in that, they were interested in ontology and cosmology and how does the material world with its suffering and evil come out of this boundless being? These are big questions. They start using binary gender to think about those processes, and they put the gendered Shekhinah in relation to other aspects of divinity. But so the next trans Shekhinah essay that I'm hoping to do is about the gendering of the Shekhinah, who kind of is incarnated by human beings into binary gender. So she's, nominally female for a long time, but she's not really part of a binary gender system until the mystics come along and they inscribe her into it. Even when they do, and I think that one of the dangers of the way I was talking about her, the divine female, and it makes it seem like this is a binary category, right? You're this way or that, the way my trans friend and I were talking. Well, you either feel like this with your hormones or you feel like that with your hormones. That is not the way they deal with the Shekhinah, even after they gender her. There are multiple female divinity figures. There's the upper mother and the lower mother, and there's the princess and the daughter and the lost princess and the mother of wisdom. And there's a character I don't understand, but who sounds terrifying, called the Matrona, who often comes with armies. And, in other words, they did not see just assigning the Shekhinah as female as homogenizing or simplifying the Shekhinah, because they didn't see the female as homogenous or simplistic, the way binary gender encourages us to think about it.
And in a way, we are so limited by our brains, yes, but also the culture that we are in. Like, it would make total sense to me, like, we, even if we don't want to be, or we think like we are bigger thinkers than those that are locked into binary, that's the framework that we're operating within. So it makes sense to me that then the answer becomes like this polarity, this other side of the it looks like an either or situation, and it's not. And as you were saying that, I'm thinking, so for viewers, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see behind me there's a painting on the wall, and it looks like a multifaceted crystal. Go back and listen to episode 2 or 3 of this podcast. It's actually a painting of my vagina, so there you go. But what I was thinking is, it looks like a multifaceted crystal. It's got all these different colors. And what I was thinking as you were saying that, it's like, gosh, our understanding of divinity is like, we can't even talk in evolutionary terms. We're not evolving towards anything. It's like now we're just observing this one little crystal aspect. We're like, oh, I didn't see that before. Let's go really deep and look at that aspect. Let's delve into that. And then, oh, like, look at this one. And that's kind of what came up as you were talking about this historical reason for the transcendent God. I'm like, oh, right. Like, so you would pull out that facet and go, well, God, yes, like there's this piece of the divine that I didn't look at before. And so what I'm wondering, well, if that resonates with you or not, but
Yeah.
that, like, where we are now, like if this facet of the Shekinah, or the Shekinah is a facet, either way, right? Like, I don't know what and why we're looking at her now. And like, what does that mean for this particular
Mm,
moment of where we are in time?
mm. Well, I think the Shekhinah, I experience her as laughing a lot.
Yeah.
It's always been her voice has always been very amused. When I was working on Shekinah Speaks, the voice was very familiar to me, and I realized that I had heard it without recognizing it. Snatches from the time that I was a child, always laughing, and laughing because it's outside of time, and seeing us as a whole. Because whenever, I don't know about you, but whenever I'm trying to relate to divinity, I mean, I was saying that I'm looking out the window, like this is this teeny little attempt at an experience of divinity, but it's bound by time and space,
Yes.
right? And it's about what is. And I think the Shekhinah is not so much concerned with isness as with relationship. The Shekhinah is an aspect of divinity that wants to be in complete and total relationship with us. And there are a couple of sides of this. So one is the Shekhinah is the aspect of divinity that's always with us, whether the Shekhinah likes it or not. And another is the aspect of divinity that is responsive, very responsive. The presence or absence is responsive to our behavior. And the third is that the Shekhinah wants a consensual relationship. She wants us to not give in and say, well, since you're the immanent aspect of divinity, you're the ultimate peeping Tom. There's no way that I can conceal anything about myself from you. That's not the goal. The goal is for us to realize that we can choose to share our subjectivities, our lives with the Shekhinah. Like I try to remember to do that. I am not been finding this very, very difficult since the elections, weaving back to your question.
Yeah.
But, if I'm experiencing something good, I'll try to remember to say, oh, Shekhinah, please enjoy this with me. And so to try to enjoy it for two, because I feel like, what are we good for God, if not to offer human experiences? Like, why does divinity need humanity, if not to experience what humanity can experience? So I feel like the Shekhinah, when I'm doing that, I'm following the Shekhinah's prompt to stop thinking about, well, you're the Shekhinah, you know, I'm this, and we're that, and, all of this naming and identifying, and think about myself as someone who can be in relationship with what is absolutely beyond me and who is. That's not a loss of myself. There are paths, spiritual paths, where that's the loss and dissolution of the self, but the Shekhinah delights in ourselves. So she doesn't want us to, I think, lose ourselves in her, because why create us if that's the goal? So this becomes, as I said, I've been in the current moment, I think like many, well, I'm just going to speak for trans and non-binary folks, but all of the groups who are in the line of fire, I would include women who are not enthusiastic about patriarchy in old-fashioned forms. So a lot of Americans are in what I think is the line of fire of the incoming administration. So I'm shocked. Shock has gone away, but the terror and anyway, I've reacted in my time-honored survival mechanism from childhood with dissociation. And I can't feel the presence of the Shekhinah if I can't feel.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to turn it off because it's a self-protection mechanism that actually, and maybe it did help protect me in some way when I was a kid, but I was a tiny child trying to protect myself. So it's not surprising that it turns out to be dysfunctional when I'm an adult. I'm trying to turn it off because I don't think I can go through this period without being able to answer the question, where is the presence of divinity in my life, in this world? The very same crisis that I see the rabbis in the early centuries, the Common Era, as experiencing. And when I was working on trans Shekhinah, as you can see, that's unlike, it's the opposite of Shekinah Speaks. It's an essay, it's intellectual, it's not experiential, which I felt bad about, but it was something that I could do in this state of not feeling. But I also felt urgent. I thought, nah, it's more important than ever to do this work that helps people connect with the immanent aspect of divinity, which is traditionally in this binary system gendered female. Because I think a lot of people will be having this question of, yeah, where can I find divinity in a world where power has come to be occupied by people like this? Is divinity just somewhere out there where I'm part of the drop in the bucket that this nation is? Well, that's comforting in one way and it's kind of sucky in another way,
Yes.
right? So I feel like I personally need to do this work and understand the Shekhinah in her many incarnations, which I didn't know when I wrote Shekinah Speaks, that she is an evolving, that our relation to the Shekhinah and ways of imagining her and conceiving of her keep changing and evolving in relation to our needs. That feels quite urgent for me personally, and I feel like hopefully for other people. And it's an example of something larger that I think I don't have a thing against institutionalized religions in themselves. They're like every other institutions. They do horrible things, they do wonderful things, but something that I think that they can't help but do when you institutionalize ideas of divinity, which religions kind of do, is you weaken people's connection to their own theological imagination. Putting it that way is too abstract. It's theology. I mean, that's an area of study. It's abstract. This is not abstract. We can't have a relationship with divinity in any way, the divine feminine, the divine masculine, anyway, without exercising our imagination. Because again, divinity it's just everything all at once and way too much for our mind to process. So if we want to have a relationship, we need to exercise our agency and our imagination and say, well, how am I going to relate to this? What aspect of divinity do I want to relate to? That becomes idolatry if we say, and therefore God is X or God is Y. That's idolatry. We say, really, the human terms I've come up with for God, my act of imagination, I have revealed God's essence, and I'm not willing to see anything about God other than what fits in my little box. That's idolatry. But I don't think we can have a relationship just the way young children can't have a relationship with their parents without just focusing on the parent aspect of their parents and ignoring the complexity and messiness of the human beings. Your 3-year-old does not want to see your complexity and messiness. They can't handle it, right? And I think that so they imagine you as being all mommy.
Yeah.
So I think that institutionalized religions often alienate us from that power that we have to set the terms for our relationship with divinity, to imagine those terms in ways that we need to feel close to divinity. Not to say what God is, but to say how we can let God in.
In a way, this is calling to mind what we were talking about at the very beginning, and it's not exactly the same, but about creating story or right that we create for ourselves, like that's going to be supportive and nurturing. And what's also coming up, and I'm pretty sure this came up for me during our first conversation, but I don't think I said it on the recording. I think I told you later, but I'll share it here too. Is the first time I did mushrooms and how I had this incredible sense of like I had a very Alice in Wonderland sense of like I remember saying to my friends that I was doing this with, I'm like, there's nobody in charge. There's no one in charge. There's no one in charge, which was actually quite terrifying to me. It all just felt like just sort of insanity. And in that I was kind of reaching for, where is she? Where is this divine feminine that I have come to know and that's nurturing and that has supported me and held me so much in all of these challenging transitions in my life over the last 10 years? Where is she? Where did she go? And the the answer that I got was that the, it's the vastness of it. It's fucking laughable that I would ever think that I could grasp it. Like I can't. Like you said, fingernails. I would say like a cell of a fingernail. That's how it felt. Like it was, and so of course, to my limited, if not altered state, but still my limited state, it looked like chaos. It looked like just crazy town to me. But that I had found the aspect of divinity in that, kind of the way that I experience the divine feminine, I'm touching my necklace because I've got, that I experience Mary as kind of the cosmic void, like something much bigger than what the Christian church has given us. But that I had found her because that's what I needed in this lifetime. That's what was the healing aspect of her that was holding me, that could meet me where I was. I'm feeling very emotional as I'm sharing this with you. It's so interesting. I'm like tearing up a little bit, but that I needed her. That's what I needed in this lifetime. And that's what she's giving me. That's what divinity was meeting me there in that space. It's like almost like a co-created relationship of sorts.
It is
Yes.
co-created.
And yet, of course, she's like this big giant thing that I will never, it's not even a she, like it's a thing that is so big and giant and cosmic that I can't even remotely attempt to get to the fullness of it. Nor should I even try. Like that's not even the point.
Divine human relationships are always human relationships. God is always limited by the terms of human relationships. Just the way if you have a cat, your relationship with your cat is always limited by the terms the cat sets.
Right. Yes.
And so God needed I mean, I'm imagining divinity as, well, the Shekhinah. I don't know about divinity in general, but the Shekhinah, I think, values so much our needs, our desperations, our cries, because that is emotionally, we are opening the door to relationship. We're setting the terms to relationship. We're 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 giving. One of the sadnesses for me of my children growing up was I reached a point where I couldn't just take care of their needs. They didn't
Yes.
have needs that I could just take care of.
Yes.
And I project that onto divinity of like, oh, wonderful. Liz, you have a need for me that I can take care of. Because one thing I can always give you is my presence.
Yeah.
Because my presence is always with you.
Yeah. I love that. And I don't know. Joy, I'm still like, 'cause I know we're almost out of time. I just feel like we could just set a recorder up and, well, one of us is going to run out of energy sooner or later, I would imagine. So we need to take a break, but we could just keep this dialogue going for hours for me. But I'm wanting to like, I kind of want to circle back, and we've been dancing around it, but that back to that question of like, and what now? Like here we have the Shekinah, here we have this
Mhm.
shit show of where we are. Like what now? And now could be literally right now. Like what feels present and important, in this moment.
Well, I don't think I've devalued the transcendent aspect of divinity that much exactly, but one part of it I never got, which is the idea of the fear of God.
Yeah.
That felt very patriarchal and damaging. But just the other day, I was thinking, I am consumed by this fear of these people who are not worthy of being afraid of, no matter how much power they wield. I am making myself so small
Yeah.
to be afraid of them. And suddenly I thought, oh, right, that's what the fear of God gives you. It says there's only one being to be afraid of, right? Human beings can mess with you, they can hurt you, they can screw you up, they can break your heart, but there's only one being to be afraid of. And fortunately, that's a being, who sustains and loves and creates us, right? So it's a complicated relationship. It's a Godzilla meets Bambi relationship, right? That's where the fear of God comes from, like, oh my, right? That
Yes.
overwhelming me. But so that is one thing that I feel like I'm learning. But the Shekhinah is giving me something else, which is, yeah, I don't think I'm making it through if I can't continue to find divinity in my life, in myself, in the world around me. Not in the political order. I honestly, I think that the idea of democracy is an Enlightenment invention. It's a secularizing invention.
Yes.
It's not a place to look for God, one way or the other. But one of the things that authoritarianism does is wants all of us to feel devalued. It wants all of us to feel insignificant. It wants all of us to feel like there are people who matter and we are not them. You know, for us to become as like the spies who went into the land of Canaan said, we were like grasshoppers in our own eyes. And I think that to survive psychically and spiritually, we need to not be grasshoppers. We need to not feel like grasshoppers. We need to not give in to that kind of fear and the humiliation and the trolling and the triggering, all this stuff that's done to put us into to trigger these responses. And for me, locating the presence of divinity, remembering the presence of divinity, remembering that it doesn't matter who won the last election. Stars are still stars. The universe is still the universe. Earth is still Earth. Humanity is still humanity, right? And the Shekhinah is still here with us. And there's nothing that we're about to go through where she is not going to be here with us, reminding us that, yeah, we are tied together by a binary warping umbilical cord, such that we're being nourished by her and we are giving her a place to dwell. All of that is outside any of the control of these petty dictators.
Yeah. I love that you said that so much because you just sparked a really, poignant memory in me, which is 2016. And, I certainly didn't think that Hillary was a perfect candidate in any way, but I was so very excited about the idea of finally, my gosh, we're going to have a female president, even if she's mediocre. Like, how wonderful, like to experience it. And I remember watching the election returns with my nasty woman cocktail in hand because, my now ex-husband and I were so confident that, she was going to win, and just watching the returns and realizing just with that sinking feeling that this was not that a very different outcome was headed our way. And I remember at some point we turned off the TV and we looked at each other and we're just like, oh my God. Oh my God. We're thinking about the time my kids were 2 and 5, I think. It just was like, what? This is just, they're in preschool. This goes against like literally everything you teach preschoolers about how to treat people. Like we just elected somebody who doesn't even understand the basic rules that we're teaching 2 and 3-year-olds, like, what are we going to say? And I was like, you know what? Let's go outside. Let's go outside. It's California, so we could do that. And we went and we sat outside and we stared up at the night sky. And the stars were just beautiful. And it was this clear, perfect night. And it was exactly what you're saying, which is that there was something else. There's something else beyond the TV box and the people and the shit show that was yet to come, and all of the imagined shit show that was in our heads. Like there was something else that existed beyond that. And so I'm so grateful for you bringing that memory back to me because it was so comforting. And yeah,
True, it has the advantage of actually being true.
yeah,
You know, the Shekhinah wants us to remember we have the power to access the presence of divinity, because divinity is always with us, waiting to be recognized, longing to be recognized.
yeah. Well, I don't want to end this conversation, and yet it is that time. And it's just so it's so beautiful. I've been contemplating different ideas about power, and so just even you using that language, like more to come on that, listeners, because it's emerging for me right now. But Joy, just such a deep, deep gratitude for you as always, and being in conversation with you. It's such a blessing. Thank you for making the time to be here.
You are so welcome, and those feelings, just like last time, those feelings of gratitude are so mutual. Thank you so much for being in this conversation with me and for being a place where conversations like this can happen.
Yeah. Oh gosh, it's so my pleasure. And what I'm wanting to say to you listeners is, y'all, we are lucky, not in all ways, but in some ways, and in this way, to live in this time and to be able to be part of dialogues like this. And I'm lucky to get to, my 99th episode to get to do this and to also know that you're out there and you're listening and you care and you want to tune in. It is such a gift. I can't even tell you. So just big gratitude all the way around. And, until I talk to you again, take such good care of yourselves, and I'll be back with you soon.